the sealed archives of the Vatican, amidst the relics of saints and the decrees of popes, there sits a jar that does not belong. It contains no holy oil, no sacred bones. Instead, floating in the murky preservative is a piece of human flesh so grotesque that history tried to erase its very existence. This is the true legacy of King Ferdinand VII of Spain. We are often taught that monarchs rule by divine right. But Ferdinand was ruled by a biological curse, a genetic catastrophe forged by centuries of royal inbreeding that turned his own body into a torture device for the queens he took to his bed. This is not just a story of a deformed king, but of a dynasty that rotted from the inside out. Before we unseal this jar and the nightmares contained within, ensure you are subscribed to witness history's darkest secrets. And tell me in the comments below, from which city are you watching this tragedy unfold tonight? To understand the monster that Ferdinand VII would become, we must first look at the blood that poisoned him long before he took his first breath. The royal palace of Madrid in the late 18th century was a place of blinding gold and velvet, a theatre of power designed to intimidate the world. But behind the heavy tapestries and the smell of expensive incense, there lingered the stale, metallic scent of biological decay. Ferdinand was born on October 14th, 1784, at El Escorial, a monastery palace built to honor God. Yet what occurred within its walls seemed to be a direct affront to nature's laws. He was the son of King Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma. To the outside world, this was a union of two great dynasties, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, but in the cold light of genetic reality, it was a catastrophe. His parents were first cousins. Their parents were cousins for over 200 years. The Spanish royal line had been a closed circle, a serpent eating its own tail. Terrified that mixing their blood with outsiders would dilute their power, but biology exacts a price for such hubris. The result was not purity, but pollution. When the young Prince Ferdinand was presented to the court, the silence that followed was not of awe, but of uneasy recognition. He bore the unmistakable stigmata of his ancestors, the heavy, protruding lower jaw, known as the Habsburg jaw, which made speech difficult and eating a grotesque spectacle. His tongue was too large for his mouth, causing him to drool when he spoke, a detail that foreign ambassadors noted with polite revulsion in their dispatches. His body was barrel-chested, his limbs oddly disproportionate, and his skin pale and sickly. Yet, these visible deformities were merely the surface of the tragedy. It was what lay hidden beneath the royal breeches that would shape the destiny of Spain more than any war or treaty. As Ferdinand grew from a sullen child into a resentful adolescent, the court physicians began to whisper. They noticed that the prince's development was not following the standard trajectory of human anatomy. It was venturing into the realm of the anomaly. This was not a matter of simple size, which in the bawdy taverns of Madrid might have been considered a gift. This was a malformation of such singular proportion that it ceased to be a mark of virility and became a medical burden. We must turn to the primary accounts to understand the true horror of his condition. For modern language often fails to capture the shock of the era. The French writer and historian Prosper Mérimée, a man who moved in the highest circles of European society and was not easily shocked, left us a description that chills the blood, writing to his friend, the novelist Stendhal. Mérimée did not use the polite euphemisms of the court. He described Ferdinand's physical burden as being delicate at the base, but expanding to a terrifying magnitude at the tip. Comparing it to a billiard cue, this comparison is not merely a crude metaphor, it is a vital historical clue. It suggests a condition known today as macrosomia, complicated by severe structural deformities that made the simple act of human connection not only difficult, but potentially lethal to a partner. Imagine, for a moment, the psychological state of a young man trapped in such a body, in a court where gossip was the deadliest weapon. Ferdinand knew he was being laughed at. He saw the way the ladies in waiting averted their eyes, suppressing giggles behind their fans. He heard the hushed tones of his own mother, Queen Maria Luisa, who openly despised him, preferring her favorite minister, Manuel de Godoy, over her own son. The Queen once wrote in a letter that her son possessed a heart as deformed as his face. This was the environment that forged Ferdinand. He was a creature made of shame, and shame, when left to fester in the dark corridors of a palace, rarely turns into humility. It turns into malice. Ferdinand realized early on that if he could not be loved, and if he could not be admired, he would be feared. He began to wield his deformity like a weapon. The humiliation he felt when looking in the mirror was projected outward onto his servants, his tutors, and eventually, his subjects. There are accounts of his cruel humor, his delight in the discomfort of others, traits that are often found in those who feel powerless against their own nature. He became a master of dissimulation, hiding his rage behind that slack-jawed expression, waiting for the moment to strike. But the greatest tragedy of the monarchy is that the king's body is not his own. It belongs to the state. The primary duty of a king is to produce an heir. The survival of the Bourbon dynasty depended on Ferdinand reproducing, and so, despite the whispers, despite the warnings of the physicians who knew the terrifying reality of his anatomy, the machinery of the state began to turn. They needed to find a wife for this prince of nightmares. They needed a vessel to carry the next generation. Regardless of the cost to her mind or body, the search for a bride began. A search that was essentially a death sentence for the innocent woman who would be chosen. The diplomats polished their lies. The portraits were painted to flatter the prince. And far away in the kingdom of Naples, a young princess named Maria Antonia was about to be sacrificed on the altar of political necessity. She had no idea that the man she was promised to was not just a king, but a medical anomaly that would turn her wedding night into a scene of gothic horror. The year was 1802. From the sun-drenched coast of Naples came Princess Maria Antonia, a young woman of only 17 years. She was bright, educated, and possessed a fragility that stood in stark contrast to the brutal architecture of the Spanish court. She had been raised on fairy tales and the romanticized ideals of monarchy, believing that her betrothal to the Prince of Asturias was the beginning of a golden era. But as her carriage rattled over the Pyrenees and descended into the arid plains of Spain, she was not traveling toward a throne, but toward a dungeon built of protocol and silence. The tragedy of Maria Antonia is not simply that she died young, but that she was systematically dismantled, piece by piece, by the demands of a husband she could not physically endure. When she first laid eyes on Ferdinand, the illusion shattered instantly. Standing before her was not the gallant prince of the portraits, but a sullen, heavy-set figure with the wandering gaze of the paranoid. Yet, the true horror was not in his face. It was waiting behind the closed doors of the bridal chamber. The wedding night of Ferdinand and Maria Antonia remains one of the most harrowing episodes in Spanish royal history. A night that dissolved the boundary between nuptial duty and physical torture. We must remember the context of the era. For a queen, the bedroom was a workplace. Her only purpose, her sole reason for existence in the eyes of the state, was to provide a male heir. To refuse the king was treason. To fail him was a sin. But what happens when the king's demands are physically impossible? As the heavy doors of the royal suite were bolted, locking the young princess in with her stranger husband, the atmosphere was not one of intimacy, but of impending calamity. Primary accounts from the ladies-in-waiting who stood guard outside describe a silence that was soon broken not by whispers of affection, but by sounds of genuine distress. The anatomical anomaly that Prosper Mérimée had described with such clinical detachment was, for Maria Antonia, a weapon of blunt force. The consummation of the marriage was a failure of biology. Ferdinand's condition made normal relations agonizingly difficult. It was described by later historians not as an act of love, but as a battering, a clumsy and violent attempt to force nature to bend to his will. In the days that followed, the veneer of royal glamour completely fell away. Maria Antonia, in a state of shock and physical trauma, wrote secret letters to her mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples. These letters are the primary sources that strip away the propaganda of the Spanish court. She did not speak of a husband. She spoke of a beast. In one heartbreaking correspondence, she described the king as having a terrifying aspect and referred to their nightly ordeals as a martyrdom. She wrote, "I have been deceived. This is not a life, it is a slow death." The ink on these pages seems almost to tremble with her fear. She was isolated in a foreign land, surrounded by spies, and subjected night after night to a physical duty that left her bleeding and terrified. The situation became a crisis of state. The court physicians, realizing that the prince's anatomy was causing genuine injury to the princess, were forced to intervene. This is where the story descends into the macabre. The bedroom became a laboratory. Doctors began to design specific medical aids, cushions with strategic hollows and padded restraints, intended to mitigate the impact of Ferdinand's deformity. Imagine the humiliation of a young woman, barely out of childhood, having her marital bed surrounded by surgeons and cold instruments, treating the act of conception with the grim efficiency of a veterinary procedure. The romance was excised with a scalpel. Only the mechanics remained. Yet, despite the cushions, despite the medical interventions, and despite the prayers whispered in the dark, there was no air. There was only trauma. Maria Antonia's health began to collapse under the strain, the stress of living with a man who was becoming increasingly erratic and cruel, combined with the physical toll of their intimacy, weakened her immune system. She suffered 2 miscarriages, events that Ferdinand, in his supreme narcissism, blamed on her. He saw her inability to carry his child not as a result of his own biological incompatibility, but as a personal failure on her part, perhaps even a deliberate act of sabotage. The sandwich of her existence was complete. Crushed between the physical impossibility of her husband and the relentless political pressure of the crown, by 1806, the light had gone out of her eyes. Tuberculosis, the white plague of the era, took hold of her weakened frame, but those closest to her knew the truth. She died of despair. When she finally passed away on May 21st, 1806, she was only 21 years old. The court went into official mourning, draping the palace in black crepe. But Ferdinand's reaction was chillingly practical. He did not weep for the wife he had terrified. He merely looked at the empty space beside him and realized he needed a replacement. The machine of state required a son, and so, before Maria Antonia was even cold in her grave, the diplomats were already scanning the maps of Europe, looking for the next vessel, the next victim who would be forced to endure the burden of the king's curse. If the death of the first wife was a tragedy, the arrival of the second, Maria Isabel of Portugal, marked the transition of the royal court from a palace into a pathology clinic. By 1816, the problem of Ferdinand's anatomy was no longer a whisper. It was a crisis of state that required engineering solutions. The king was 32. His paranoia deepening with every year of childlessness. His body becoming heavier. His temper shorter. The physicians understood that simply providing a new wife was not enough. The vessel had broken once. They needed to ensure the next one survived long enough to breed. And so, the royal bedroom witnessed the birth of a macabre ingenuity. Imagine, for a moment, that you are the royal physician in Madrid during this suffocating summer. You are summoned not to cure a fever, but to solve a mechanical puzzle of flesh. You stand over drafting tables, sketching devices that have no place in a Christian marriage. It was during this period that the infamous circular cushion was invented, a donut-shaped pad constructed of velvet and leather, with a hole cut in the center. Its purpose was grimly practical, to act as a buffer, a physical limiter that would prevent the king's fall. Monstrous dimensions, from causing fatal internal injury to the queen. The intimacy of the crown had been reduced to geometry. There was no romance here, only the cold friction of necessity. Maria Isabel, gentle and art-loving, arrived into this orchestrated nightmare with wide, hopeful eyes, but she soon learned that her role was that of a patient, not a partner. The cushions were deployed, the oils were applied, the doors were locked. Yet, even with these interventions, the process was agonizing. She lived in a state of perpetual terror, flinching at the sound of the king's heavy footsteps in the hallway. But the true horror of Maria Isabel's story is not how she lived, but how she died. It is a tale that rivals the darkest Gothic fiction of Edgar Allan Poe. In 1818, she went into a difficult labor. The baby was in a breech position, and the doctors, terrified of Ferdinand's wrath should the heir die, panicked. Maria Isabel lost consciousness. Her breathing became so shallow, her pulse so faint, that the clumsy physicians declared her dead. But she was not dead. She was merely in a syncope, a deep faint brought on by agony. Ferdinand, displaying the emotional depth of a stone, demanded the baby be extracted immediately to save the soul of the heir. The surgeons, obeying their king, took their blades to the warm, living flesh of the queen. As the first incision was made, a sound tore through the room that haunted those present for the rest of their lives. The corpse let out a terrible, guttural scream of pure agony. Maria Isabel had woken up under the knife. She died minutes later, not from childbirth, but from the shock and blood loss of a butchered crude caesarean section. The baby died soon after. The king had effectively presided over the slaughter of his own wife and child in a frantic bid for immortality. Ferdinand was undeterred. The blood was barely scrubbed from the floorboards when he turned his gaze to Saxony. The third candidate was Maria Josepha Amalia. If Maria Isabel was the victim of physical brutality, Maria Josepha was the victim of spiritual terror. She was a devout, almost fanatical Catholic, raised in a convent-like atmosphere where the body was seen as a vessel of sin. When she arrived in Madrid and saw Ferdinand, this aging, rotting hulk of a man with his terrifying deformity, she did not just feel fear, she felt religious revulsion. To her, he looked like a demon manifested in flesh. On their wedding night, she did something no one expected. She refused him. She fled to the corner of the room, clutching her crucifix, screaming that to lay with such a monster was a mortal sin against God. Ferdinand, enraged and humiliated, could not force her. His power stopped at the wall of her pious hysteria. The situation was so absurd, so desperate, that it required intervention from the highest power in Christendom. The king had to write to the Pope. Yes, Pope Pius VII was forced to send a letter to the young queen. explicitly telling her that intimate relations with her deformed husband were not a sin, but a holy duty required for the salvation of the Spanish crown. Armed with this papal decree, Maria Josepha submitted, but she didn't participate. She endured. She lay beneath him like a martyr on a rack, eyes closed, praying the rosary while the king and his cushions performed the necessary mechanics. For 10 years, this grim ritual continued. 10 years of dry, loveless friction, 10 years of silence. And in the end, her body simply gave up. She died in 1829, childless, her spirit broken by a decade of sanctified rape. Ferdinand was now 45. He had buried 3 wives. He had no heir. The Bourbon line was teetering on the edge of extinction, and the king's body was beginning to fail him. But in the shadows of the court, a 4th bride was already waiting. A woman who would finally understand that to survive the monster, one must become the master. By 1829, the royal palace had become a tomb for the living. But the arrival of the 4th wife, Maria Christina of the 2 Sicilies, brought a different energy. She was not a fragile ceramic doll like Maria Antonia, nor a pious martyr like Maria Josepha. She was vibrant, ambitious, and possessed a shrewd intelligence that unnerved the aging king. Ferdinand was now 45, but he looked 80, his body ravaged by years of gluttony, gout, and the stress of his own biology, was failing. He could no longer walk without agony. His hands shook, and his temper was as volatile as gunpowder. Yet, his obsession with producing an heir had not waned. It had mutated into a terrifying paranoia. He knew that Maria Christina was his last chance, but unlike his previous wives, whom he viewed as mere vessels, he viewed Christina with deep suspicion. He was convinced that she, like the rest of the world, was mocking him. He believed that if he closed his eyes for even a moment, she would betray him, with a lover, with a spy, or simply by existing without his permission. To satisfy this madness, Ferdinand ordered structural modifications to the Queen's private apartments. He had carpenters drill secret peepholes, small, inconspicuous slits hidden behind tapestries and oil paintings that looked directly into her dressing room, her boudoir, and even her prayer corner. Imagine the psychological suffocation of living in such a space. Maria Christina was never truly alone. She could feel the weight of his gaze, even when he was not in the room. Servants reported seeing the king, dragging his swollen leg, limping silently down the hidden service corridors to press his eye against the wall. Watching his wife for hours, he monitored her breathing, her reading, the way she combed her hair. It was a domestic panopticon. He was searching for a sign of infidelity, but in reality, he was searching for a reflection of his own inadequacy. This paranoia extended to the dinner table. Ferdinand became convinced that his enemies, the liberals, the Freemasons, perhaps even his own brother Don Carlos, were trying to poison him. Every meal became a tedious ritual of toxicology. The food had to be tasted by the cook, then by a servant, and finally by the Queen herself, before the king would dare to let a morsel pass his Habsburg lips. The joy of eating was replaced by the fear of dying. And then, the impossible happened. Maria Christina announced she was pregnant. The court held its breath. The king wept with a mix of relief and manic triumph. But this pregnancy brought with it a political earthquake that would shatter Spain for decades under the ancient Salic law, which the Bourbons had imported from France. A woman could not inherit the throne. If the child was a girl, the crown would pass to Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, a rigid, ultra-conservative religious zealot who despised Ferdinand's wavering policies. Ferdinand, driven by spite against his brother and a desperate need to validate his own biological legacy, made a decision that changed history. He issued the Pragmatica Sanction, a decree that overturned centuries of tradition and allowed a female heir to inherit the crown. It was a legal grenade thrown into a crowded room. When the child was born on October 10th, 1830, and it was revealed to be a girl, Isabella, the king declared victory, but his brother declared war. The birth of Isabella should have been a moment of joy. Instead, it was the prologue to a bloodbath. The king's final gamble had succeeded in producing an heir, but it had guaranteed that her reign would be soaked in blood. As he looked at the infant, Isabella, Ferdinand saw his own redemption, but the court saw only trouble. The king's health began to collapse rapidly after the birth. It was as if the effort of willing this child into existence had drained the last of his vitality. In his final years, the king became a pitiable, rotting figure. He spent his days in a delirious haze, drifting between lucidity and madness. He would clutch the infant, Isabella, whispering warnings to her about the wolves at the door. He made the court swear allegiance to her over and over again, his voice cracking, his eyes wild with the fear that his legacy would be erased the moment his heart stopped beating. The peepholes, the secret police, the cushions, the torture of his wives, all of it had led to this: a fragile baby girl sitting on a powder keg, and the fuse was burning short. By September of 1833, the atmosphere inside the royal palace of Madrid had become unbreathable. It was not merely the tension of a looming civil war. It was the physical stench of the monarch himself. Ferdinand VII was dying, but he was not fading away peacefully. His body, overwhelmed by decades of excess and genetic failure, had begun to succumb to necrosis while he was still breathing. The servants burned heavy incense and myrrh in the corridors, desperate to mask the sickly sweet odour of gangrene that seeped from the royal bedchamber. It was a gruesome metaphor manifest in flesh. The corruption of the state was now mirrored perfectly in the corruption of the king's own tissues. On September 29th, 1833, the end finally came. Ferdinand breathed his last, his face contorted in a final grimace of pain or perhaps realization. But for the royal physicians, the work was not finished. In the silence that followed the king's death, a final secret order was given. It is a moment that historians have debated in hushed tones for nearly 2 centuries. Before the body was prepared for the state funeral, before the lying in state, where thousands would file past to pay their respects to the desired one, the doctors performed a clandestine autopsy. They were not looking for the cause of death. They knew it well enough. They were looking to secure a specimen with the precision of men who knew they were committing a sacrilege. They surgically removed the king's defining feature, the massive, malformed member that had terrorized 4 queens and dictated the misery of a nation. It was not an act of mockery, but of scientific preservation. They placed the anatomical anomaly into a glass jar filled with spirits, sealing it with wax and the heavy burden of silence. It was then transported, through channels known only to the highest clergy, to the secret archives of the Vatican, where it remains catalogued as a medical curiosity too disturbing for the public eye. Outside the palace walls, the chaos that Ferdinand had brewed was already boiling over. The moment his death was announced, the fragile peace shattered. His brother, Don Carlos, refused to recognize the infant Isabella as queen. The First Carlist War erupted, a brutal conflict that would tear Spain apart for 7 years, soaking the fields in blood. But inside the silent chamber, the king's body lay empty, finally relieved of the burden that had defined his entire existence. The irony was absolute. Ferdinand had spent his life trying to assert his dominance, to prove his virility, to force his will upon the world. Yet, in the end, His legacy was reduced to two things: a war that destroyed his country, and a jar of formaldehyde hidden in the dark, containing the monstrous piece of flesh that had been his master all along. We often look at history through the lens of great battles and signed treaties, forgetting that the destiny of empires is sometimes decided by the capricious cruelty of biology. Ferdinand VII believed he was chosen by God to rule, but he was merely a victim of his own bloodline, a man trapped in a body that was built for tragedy. He destroyed the lives of 4 women, not out of malice alone, but out of a desperate, flailing need to fix what nature had broken. Today, tourists walk the halls of the royal palace in Madrid, admiring the chandeliers and the portraits, unaware of the screams that once echoed off those gilded walls. They do not know about the cushions, the instruments, or the peepholes drilled into the silk, but far away, in the cool, dust-mote silence of the Vatican archives, the truth remains suspended in liquid. It sits there, a grotesque monument to human folly. It serves as a final, haunting reminder that no amount of gold, no amount of power, and no royal decree can ever truly conquer the darkness that lives within our own veins.